Major support for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Does the stock market volatility, uncertainty, and nervousness point to anything that could be problems for the economy in the Carolinas? Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina policy, business, and public affairs. I am Chris William, and as we do each week, we will talk about what is important and what is going on here in our region. Experts like Ted Pitts from the South Carolina Chamber and Brian Etheridge from Leadership North Carolina join us, and later on, a CEO from one of South Carolina's leading manufacturer and corporate citizens, Mikee Johnson from Cox Industries.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Ted Pitts from the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce, Brian Etheridge of Leadership North Carolina, and special guest Mikee Johnson, President and CEO of Cox Industries.
Welcome to our program. Thank you for watching, gentlemen. Good to see you again. Brian, Ted, good to have you both here.
It's good to be here.
Pleasure to be back.
You know, Brian, not to start on a down note, but Parkland, Florida tragedy was of course horrible, and it was tragic. And it seemed like an unintended consequence out of that morbidity and mortality was that there seems to be an activated teen demographic taking real leadership around an issue in this country that is prickly and thorny, and that is the idea of guns and gun control. As a leadership expert, do you see that? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you see that as something that could really bring now a dialogue that could move the ball forward, that both sides could agree that there's some constructive dialogue about that type of thing?
Chris, I appreciate you asking that, and I think this may be one of those instances in our culture, and we've seen this with other kind of big social movements sometimes, that they're in cases are tipping points. And I think this may very well be one where the young people are the ones that are indeed leading the charge, and it may be that some of our elected officials follow them, but they're being very articulate and very pointed, and saying we don't want this anymore. And I think a lot of it is stemming from a generation that has dealt with a lot of challenges, and they've seen some of the ugliness of our society, and are really moved to say, all right, we're done with this. We're going to take up the baton, and we're going to make change happen.
You know, Ted, this is a club that nobody wants to join, and that's gun violence. And gun violence at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston was certainly that tragic. As you heard the question with Brian about this issue, that now it's different, that there are kids and there's a demographic that's led the charge in the General Assembly in Florida. And in South Carolina, this is all too close to home. How do you answer that question?
You know, I think leaders need to sit down, and they need to listen, and they need to have a conversation about the issue. So I think ultimately everybody, no matter whether you're the most ardent gun rights individual or you're an anti-gun individual, understands that we have a problem. When this keeps happening time and time again, we need to have a conversation. You know, mentally disturbed individuals, kids in a lot of cases here, we need to find out what we can do to prevent this from happening the next time. And I think that requires leadership. And I think we're hopeful that there are dialogue and conversation that will occur, and we'll have leaders step up and try to address the issue with mental health and access to weapons for individuals that don't need those weapons.
So what did in the kind of the wake of the Confederate flag debate that South Carolina has seemed to have handled pretty well, of course, former Governor Nikki Haley, what can be learned through that that process as well?
You know, when an issue is big enough, it requires leaders. They can't look the other way. So at that time, Governor Haley stood up at the very beginning and said, we're going to have a conversation about this. And I'll call the General Assembly back and force them to have a conversation. But leaders in South Carolina didn't need that. They came together and worked out a solution that most felt was the right thing to do. And ultimately, in a democracy, that's what happened. So, you know, I guess we're hopeful that in tragedies like this, that good comes out of it, and has our leaders sit down and work on problems.
And one more question about the leadership thing, Brian. In other issues like economic mobility, economic opportunity, Medicare funding, opioid epidemic, how can you take this same intelligence around very thorny issues and bring to bear constructive dialogue?
With those issues you mentioned in particular, they're big enough and, as you said, thorny enough, where in a lot of cases you'll get folks from all sides of that issue willing to come together and sit down at the same table. I think one of the things that has to happen regardless of the issue is having leaders build rapport with one another and a level of trust so that, as Ted was saying, you can work towards solutions and find common ground. But that's going to be the critical part, is getting those leaders around the table, building rapport with one another, building that level of trust, and exercising that leadership to where folks are really focusing on the fact of, here's the end goal of what we want, and how can we collaborate together to get the best outcome.
Do you see some of that happening? I don't want to put words in your mouth. North Carolina has a Democratic governor, has a clearly Republican General Assembly, and a year ago they were at polar opposites in so many things. Do you see that there is a thawing in that relationship and that they can deal with these kind of issues without demonizing one another?
We've seen some big issues where they have found that common ground and working together around economic development and some incentives and some big projects that we've been working on. There's still tension there, and I'm not going to gloss over that. There are real substantive changes and challenges. But there are some of those bigger issues that the politics gets put aside, at least for a time being, and those leaders can collaborate and work toward the better goals of the state. South
Carolina's a big issue in the General Assembly during the session, Ted, and I know I'm not telling you anything, is what to do with SCANA and Santee Cooper. So what to do with SCANA and Santee Cooper? What happens? What does this end up looking like?
Yeah, policymakers in South Carolina have a really tough situation that they're having to deal with. I mean, when you look at the failure at V.C. Sumner and the costs that have been passed through to ratepayers, I think what the Chamber is most interested in seeing happen is what's in the best long-term interest of ratepayers. So there are some that think, you can come in and very quickly fix the problem. You can't. So we've got to make sure that whatever the General Assembly does is, first, that they take the time to understand the unintended consequences, and second, we would advise them to bring in outside expertise to help them make these very difficult decisions. But something has to be done, let's be clear. Currently in the situation where it is, I don't think anybody can tell you with certainty what the outcome should be or will be, but I can tell you that we need to make sure that state policy leaders have outside institutional knowledge brought in to help them make these very difficult decisions. It's a tough situation.
Yeah, so are you finding that these political leaders in South Carolina, Shane Massey was in that chair right there, and this is my term, but he was calling it despicable that Santee Cooper did this, SCANA did this, but this was done in the light of day over a period of years with the public staff as well as the General Assembly watching all of this happen. So there seems like I don't want to use the term, there's a lot of blame to go around, but can the politicians look at this without some of the emotional heat and make a good decision?
So I think that's what the time allows for that to be able to happen. Politicians are mad, they should be. Ratepayers, the business community is mad, they should be. When this decision was made to go forward with V.C. Summer, it was a very prudent decision. It was the right thing to do. A lot of things have changed since then. So really what the General Assembly's focused a lot of their time on is drilling down in who knew what when from over the last couple years, and did we continue to make a bad decision on top of another bad decision. So those things need to be vetted out. But I think what really is key is to make sure that, with some of the proposals in the legislature, they would put South Carolina's regulatory environment in a very bad place. S&P and Moody's both have downgraded South Carolina as a bad place for investment when it comes to utility ratings. So even if you're not Santee Cooper or SCANA, and you're a customer of another utility, these bills that are moving through the General Assembly in some ways will negatively impact your bill. If you're a utility customer of another utility, your bill could go up because of the way the bill was drafted that passed to Durham.
So higher cost at some point, possibly. So how would you handicap? One of the great things about South Carolina and North Carolina, in fact, was that low cost of energy for economic development purposes. And I'm sorry, I'm probably stating what you know in your DNA, Ted. But how would you handicap that this low cost of energy could end up going up?
So, if you look, there's 3 or 4 service providers in South Carolina. It's different in each territory. And so I would tell you that energy for a manufacturer that uses a lot of energy, it's at the front of their list on things that they're asking questions about. If costs go up, it's bad for business in South Carolina across the board, existing business and economic development. And ultimately, that's what the Chamber is concerned about, is we want to deal with this very unfortunate situation that unfortunately is going to require leadership. And we want to do it in a way that doesn't have long-term consequences that we're paying for years to come.
Ted, thank you. Brian, thank you. Incidentally, we're going to ask somebody you know well next week that same question. Secretary Bobby Hitt from the Commerce Department of South Carolina will be our guest on this program. Also, speaking of commerce, Tony Copeland, Secretary of Commerce in North Carolina. And also coming up, his name is Tom Lowe, and Lowe's Foods has been Tim Lowe has been competing with a lot of the big players in retail, food retailing in the Carolinas. Tim Lowe will be here representing Lowe's Foods. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more philanthropic, community-minded, politically sensitive, caring big business leader in the Carolinas, not to embarrass him too much. But our guest is third-generation family business owner hailing from the Midlands area of South Carolina that seems to put his money and his energy where his mouth is. Cox Industries President and CEO Mikee Johnson. Mikee, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Mikee, when you heard POTUS, when you heard Donald Trump talk about transportation and infrastructure in the State of the Union, were you encouraged for South Carolina?
Sure. I mean, obviously, South Carolina's just come off of a very long political argument about and discussion and ultimately resolution on how to move our ground infrastructure forward in terms of our roads. But, when you also looked at his plan, it also talks about water infrastructure. We don't nearly talk about water enough. It's a hot topic out west, but that was a component. And also a big component is the rural roads component of his plan. South Carolina the state owns a lot of rural roads, and they need a lot of work. And so to hear those kind of pieces come out of the president, knowing how they're going to impact our state and dovetail on the work we've already done, is extremely encouraging.
Does the calculus behind it, like many people have said, well, the federal government's going to do $200 billion and the state's going to do the 80%.
Right.
I mean, that's going to be a heavy lift for the states that are already trying to figure this out. Could that undermine this plan?
Well, I mean, clearly you got to come up with the money, right? And the money has to come from somewhere, and so that's not lost on the states. But the block grants, when you put it back to the rural communities and you give them a chance to make a difference, that's important in South Carolina. And I think they're also going to reward those states that have already shown a commitment. Now, other states that got ahead of this might see a little more advantage early on, but I think the states will respond and realize that we've waited a long time to put our money where our mouth is in our infrastructure, and if we don't, there'll be consequences, particularly to the business community. Roads, for example, just moving our goods and services to our port, which creates 1 in 11 jobs in South Carolina, is important. So I don't think it'll be lost on our policy leaders in South Carolina.
Brian, question?
In preparing for this, Mikee, one of the things I noticed that we share a commonality is that we're both Eagle Scouts, and kind of that that Boy Scout motto of being prepared, and kind of what goes through scouting, that kind of ethos of stewardship and being committed to the community. Tell me how you have leveraged that and how that impacts your kind of corporate culture at Cox Industries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm always excited when I walk down our offices and see the Eagle Scout plaques that do hang on our walls. I might scan back forward to that on a resume faster than I look at anything. But I do think having also, you know, you and I talked about this earlier, being a Scoutmaster. I mean, we're teaching things in scouting that aren't taught anymore.
Are you
really
still
in schools.
Scoutmaster? Are you still
No, I did find a very willing father that took my duty when mine went to Clemson and got his Eagle Scout. So, but no, I mean, really just at the level where we're not teaching, you know, we're all about getting kids through school and getting them to college, but just these rank and file things about how we be good stewards in our community, how we give back to our community, whether it be their Eagle Scout project, the service hours to get there. So to me, whether they make it to Eagle Scout or not, as you and I know, is not really the ultimate deal, right? The journey is the deal. And so to find the right kind of, whether it be employees or coworkers or friends that we associate with, I look at it as a high mark. So but always good to talk to a fellow Eagle Scout for sure.
Thank you, sir.
Mikey, you obviously give back to the community in so many different ways, your business as well as you personally. How have you found the time to do all the things, whether it's Liberty Fellowship or you were the chairman of the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce and the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance? How have you found time to kind of balance the business interests, but understanding that a rising tide lifts all boats, and South Carolina is a place that you invest your time and money in?
Well, so fortunately, hopefully my wife won't watch and she won't have to listen to my answer, but I was very blessed that I had a wife and family that allows me to do this. But, you know, my predecessor in our business, my grandfather who started our company, he believed in the same motto. Before Cox was the size that it was, he just believed in giving back, whether it be through the church, through the community. So we've always prioritized it. And I guess as a South Carolina-based company, we've always thought that if South Carolina does well, we will inherently do well. Now, while our facilities are spread all over the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast today, we still believe it's important to we want people to come to work at Cox Industries, and we want them to be happy at Cox Industries. So when we're participating in their service programs, I think we're winning. So my board was very specific. They said spend 80% of your time looking outside and 20% of your time looking inside, and we think the company will be rewarded. And that's been our experience. So,
you know, Mikey, it happened a few weeks ago, and that is took off like one of Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets, and that was this idea that Amazon, J.P. Morgan, Berkshire Hathaway were going to come together and form their own whatever a new plan, healthcare plan, would work as a private organization. It seemed to kind of go away after the initial stuff. Is it going to take something like that to retool the healthcare dialogue in this country? And would you expect that Amazon could lead and have some kind of model that we could look at to say, hey, you know, this is worth looking at?
Well, I'm certainly a big believer that the private sector can, and this is not a criticism of the government, there's certain core functions of government that I think they're going to be, that nobody else can coalesce around and build an issue, but I do think knowing that healthcare is really driven by the private sector, whether it be the care, the insurance. So whether it's an Amazon or one of these major corporate entities, I mean, you go back to look at the Industrial Revolution in this country, it wasn't led by government, it was led by the private sector. So what's to think that a service like health insurance, which is often lost on the fact that healthcare is maybe where our issue is more so than health insurance, but we often mix the two. So yeah, I think, you know, can we administer a program better by the private sector for the private sector? I would say absolutely, and those folks that can really put that kind of money where their mouth is are definitely the ones that would most likely lead that.
So when you look across the enterprise of Cox Industries, is the healthcare cost, is that one of those sensitivity issues that's like the third rail for you when it comes to cost control?
No doubt, it's staggering, and in fact, what you find is we've almost as business owners, we've been lulled to sleep that it is something we can't avoid, right? It's something being impressed upon us as business leaders. And so our board just talked about this not long ago. We haven't really talked about our healthcare costs yet, other than buying wood, buying chemical, and making our payroll. It is our fourth largest cost. And it's staggering. Even then, it's almost unaffordable, you know, for the frontline worker who's just trying to go about every day, raise their family, you know, build a nest egg, send their kids to school, and move them. So without a doubt, it is the most daunting and almost to the point where nobody really wants to tackle it. So I think it's demoralizing as well as financially crippling.
Brian?
Mikey, in looking at all the challenges that a manufacturer faces, I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about kind of the education and workforce development piece, and particularly how that impacts a manufacturer like Cox Industries that's got a presence, obviously deep roots in South Carolina, but across the Eastern Seaboard and the Gulf Coast, as you said.
Yeah, so I think you see two great pieces coming together. That's a great question, Brian. You see two great pieces coming together with both the work that the state is doing in South Carolina. We've just had a couple programs of late, Job Ready U, which is really a soft skill based program, which is driven by our Department of Employment and Workforce, as well as our Second Chance program. I mean, I remember when I was growing up stacking lumber on the lumber yard when I was a youngster, I worked with a prison release program, and it was very successful, and it gave somebody a second chance to come back out. No different. We just put a similar program back in place in South Carolina. It's just coming out of the gates. But we're seeing that, and clearly from a workforce standpoint, it's great to have all these big companies coming to South Carolina, but if we can't fill the jobs, that's a problem. We have good wages that are coming out that we're seeing these new manufacturers come in and pay. We have an existing platform with our tech school system in South Carolina, which, all due respect, North Carolina would put us as second to none. And so we do have the pieces in place, and we're having, just like North Carolina, we have people moving into South Carolina. So how we inject them in our workforce and show what the options are, I do think is important. In fact, Ted and I were talking earlier about a Be Proud program, just to introduce them to the, students coming out of school. There are opportunities right out of school to get into the workforce and make a really good living that don't require you necessarily to tackle a 4-year degree right out of school.
Let me follow up on this. Sorry, Ted, just quickly. Doesn't that idea or the management of that kind of program live within the technical college system?
Sure. I think they end up becoming the best operators of a program like that, and I think those are obviously the intentions in South Carolina to see that happen. But I look at some of our jobs around our organization. When you have truck drivers making $80,000, $90,000 a year, they're not just delivering point A to point B. They have other responsibilities. But when you see these jobs that whether it be plumbing, electrician, when did it become not a good thing, an honorable profession to do that kind of work and make a really good living? And to see that coming back it took a little bit of a crisis. It took a labor shortage for that to come back, but I think we're starting to see that come back as being meaningful, and the tech system will definitely be where it'll be driven for sure.
Go ahead, Tim.
When you look at South Carolina, we're at less than 4% unemployment, which is basically full employment. You look at all the jobs that are coming to the state. As an existing South Carolina industry, what are your concerns, and then what sort of solutions does South Carolina need to have in place, whether it's in migration or other things, to make sure we can fill the jobs?
Sure. I'm first a little worried about our statistics. I think we've gotten very hung up on our unemployment statistic. We still have a workforce that's not fully re-engaged, I believe, that we need to get re-engaged. I think if you add the shrinkage in the workforce participation rate, we're probably still, even nationally, probably at a 9 or 10%. You can see the different pundits argue. So I think we have to find a way to encourage people to get back into the workforce system and to know there are jobs that they can get readily and quickly trained for and move back into the system that is a better way to live than hoping the system will float their existence. And so that to me is a little scary that we have that conundrum. But in terms of South Carolina, a lot of times just the sheer fact that we have the programs in place and the people don't know we have them in place, Ted, that's what really concerns me. This Second Chance program, obviously, I'm sure our prison system will be probably good at promoting that, but I wonder about our Job Ready U, which are the soft skills program, back to the scouting thing we talked about, Brian. Just filling out a resume, getting in the door, knowing how to show up to work, those are things as parents we hope we teach our children, but if you've missed that window, it's now incumbent upon us as a community of citizens to bring those folks into the workforce. So I think we could keep implementing more and more new programs, but the ones we have, I think, can be really effective. But how do we promote those, whether it be the Chamber, the North Carolina Leadership Program? How do we promote those programs? That, to me, is where I think we can have the biggest impact.
So
right
what's
now.
your gut? How to promote them better?
Yeah, we got to dress Ted up and send him out on TV more. No, I think it also needs to be incumbent back upon the business leaders in the community, right?
To talk about it, promote it?
Right. So not just out of desperation. We need to be talking about it all the time. It needs to be part of our regular core. This is not to say we do it better, but you do see some of our larger manufacturers who who need these qualified workers, whether it be a Boeing in our low country that's partnering with the tech college system to bring their, to train employees and bring them through in cooperation with state government, to fund and make that happen. So, I mean, I think the more the business community addresses that and puts it out there that we have jobs, we're ready, here's a way to get here, I think that, and we just can't depend on the state to always be promoting our programs.
Mikee, thanks for being on the program. I'm sorry, as always, we run out of time, but we'll hound you until you come back again. So thank you for being on the program.
Good to be in Charlotte.
Yeah, nice to see you. Ted, always nice to see you.
Always good to see you.
Brian, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm going to take a personal point of preference right now, brag a little bit because I'm so honored to work with so many people that are not in front of the camera, but behind the camera, and make it work so well. We have two staff people that are worth recognizing. First is our graphics operator. Her name is Cindy Sheehan. Cindy, why it's important to know about her is Cindy just got the Chairman's Award for national recognition from the Chairman of American Airlines for being among the best nationally in a 100,000 strong employee organization. Cindy, we're so proud of you. Despite the fact you're from New Jersey, we're glad that you're on our team. And then finally, Tom Green, who's our chief engineer, has left after 28 years of working on this program. Sometimes he didn't like it, but he always did a good job. Tom, we're going to miss you as well. So honored. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, Barings, Grant Thornton, Novant Health, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.